Rachel Morgan had repaired radios in dusty warehouses, in cramped armored trucks, and even once on a windswept oil rig. But nothing about her previous assignments had prepared her for the sight that greeted her as the transport van rolled through the security checkpoint of the naval base that morning. The place didn't just hum with order, it pulsed with it. Everywhere she looked, men in uniform moved with precision. Some jogged in formation across the parade ground, boots pounding in unison, while others carried crates of gear with an efficiency that spoke of endless drills. The sharp bark of commands echoed across the base, punctuated by the metallic clatter of equipment and the rhythmic whistle of training exercises. Rachel hugged her toolkit to her chest, as if its battered steel frame could shield her from the weight of all those watchful eyes. She wasn't military. She wasn't built for this. She was a civilian contractor with a knack for electronics, hired for one job: fix the malfunctioning communication gear in the command center. She had told herself 100 times that morning that it was no different from repairing radios anywhere else. Wires were wires, circuits were circuits. But as the van pulled away, and she stood there in her plain polo shirt and work pants, surrounded by men and women in immaculate uniforms, Rachel felt like a single ink stain on a page of crisp white paper. She adjusted her glasses, drew in a breath, and forced her feet forward. Inside the facility, the air was cooler, but no less intimidating. The corridors smelled faintly of polish and oil. Framed photographs of decorated officers lined the walls, their stern gazes seeming to follow her as she walked. She passed a group of recruits jogging through the hallway, sweat dripping down their faces, and felt them glance her way with fleeting curiosity before disappearing around the corner. Rachel kept her head down, wishing she could vanish into the tiles. She had grown up around military bases. Her father had served in the Air Force, but she had never been comfortable with the culture. The rigid hierarchy, the constant discipline, the unspoken rules that civilians could never quite grasp. She respected it, of course, but from the outside, like someone admiring a mountain range without ever wanting to climb it. At the command center doors, a young ensign checked her badge. He gave her the briefest nod, professional but detached, before waving her through. Inside, the room buzzed with controlled chaos. Officers leaned over maps spread across wide tables, radios hissed with static, and a bank of monitors glowed with live feeds of training operations. The energy was electric-focused, tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Rachel slipped into a corner, quietly setting down her toolkit. She wasn't introduced to anyone, and no one asked her name. To them, she was just the comms girl, here to tinker with wires while the real work went on around her. That suited Rachel fine. She preferred to blend into the background, unnoticed. She knelt by a console, popping open a side panel to reveal a tangled nest of wires. Her hands moved automatically, sorting, untangling, checking connections. This was her language, one she understood far better than the clipped military jargon flying across the room. Out there, she stumbled. In here, with circuits and solder, she was fluent. Still, she couldn't help but notice the atmosphere around her. The SEALs weren't just another military unit. They radiated something heavier, sharper. These were men trained to operate in the shadows, to endure extremes most people couldn't imagine. Even in this controlled environment, they carried themselves with an intensity that made Rachel's skin prickle. Every movement was deliberate, every word precise. A senior officer stalked past her, barking into a headset. "Echo team, confirm position. We don't have all day." His voice boomed like a whip crack, drawing immediate responses from subordinates. Rachel flinched slightly, though the command wasn't directed at her. She tried to focus on the wires, but her thoughts wandered. Why had she taken this assignment? The money was decent, sure, but there were easier jobs. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe some reckless part of her had wanted to see what life looked like inside one of the most secretive and demanding corners of the military. Or maybe she admitted to herself she wanted to prove something, that she wasn't just a background figure, a contractor no one remembered after the job was done. Still, as she adjusted a loose connector and watched sparks dance faintly, Rachel shook her head. Who was she kidding? These men risked their lives daily in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. She fixed radios. That was all. A group of SEALs entered the room then, sweat-soaked from training, their presence immediately shifting the air. They were younger than she expected, though their eyes carried a weight beyond their years. One of them, a tall lieutenant with sharp features and an easy stride, swept his gaze across the room and paused, just briefly, on Rachel. It wasn't hostility, more like curiosity, but it still sent her heart thumping. She quickly looked back down at the wires, cheeks warming. She tried to disappear into her work, humming faintly under her breath, but the thought gnawed at her. She didn't belong here. If she made a mistake, if she failed, would they laugh? Or worse, would they see her as a liability? She hated the feeling of eyes on her, of silent judgment hanging in the air. And yet, deep down, a small spark of defiance burned. Let them watch. Let them doubt her. She knew these machines better than anyone in the room. Radios didn't care about uniforms or ranks. If she did her job right, the wires would sing again, no matter who held the headset. Rachel tightened a bolt, the metal ringing softly in her hand. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. This was just another job. She would fix the comms, pack up, and slip away unnoticed. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But plans had a way of unraveling, especially in places where pressure never slept. Outside, through the glass wall of the command center, she could see teams assembling on the training grounds. The exercise looked intense, simulated urban combat, judging by the maps she'd glimpsed. Radios were already hissing, voices overlapping, and she could sense the importance of every signal, every order. This wasn't just a drill. It was practice for the kind of missions that never made the news. Missions where silence could mean death. Rachel swallowed hard, her fingers lingering on a bundle of frayed wires. A chill ran through her. She couldn't know it yet, but within the hour, those wires would pull her into the very heart of the operation, forcing her into a spotlight she never wanted. For now, though, she stayed in her corner, a quiet figure crouched over circuits, dwarfed by the weight of the world around her. A civilian among warriors, an outsider on sacred ground. And yet, destiny had already marked her moment. Rachel adjusted her glasses again as she crouched on the floor of the command center, the cool metal tiles pressing against her knees. She had found a spot tucked just beside a row of consoles, far enough to be out of the way, but close enough to reach the wiring clusters she needed to check. It was a strategic choice, hidden but not invisible. Still, she felt the weight of glances brushing against her back like gusts of wind she couldn't quite escape. No one said anything to her. No introductions, no acknowledgments, just the occasional sidelong look from men and women who had spent years in uniforms while she had spent hers behind circuit boards. She wasn't offended. She understood. To them, she wasn't part of the machine. She was a contractor, a visitor, someone whose presence was tolerated but not integrated. Her hands moved steadily through the tools in her case, a voltmeter, spools of wire, cutters, a soldering iron. Familiar instruments, reliable. She found comfort in the rhythm of laying them out, each in its proper place, like a pianist arranging sheet music before the first note. Out there, in the world of sharp salutes and booming orders, she floundered. Here, with the smell of hot metal and the hum of circuits, she could breathe. But the command center wasn't silent. It was a storm wrapped in four walls. The overhead speakers crackled with clipped voices. Alpha Squad, confirmed checkpoint Bravo. A monitor lit up with infrared silhouettes moving in formation. Officers huddled around tables, whispering in low, urgent tones, occasionally stabbing a finger at a map. Somewhere behind her, a printer whirred, spitting out sheets of coordinates. It was overwhelming, the sheer volume of information rushing through the room, the way everyone seemed tuned into some frequency she couldn't hear. Rachel forced herself to stay focused on her task, but her ears kept catching fragments. Hostage scenario. Breach point. Fire team rotation. Even though she knew it was all training, not live combat, the intensity made her chest tighten. She tugged gently at a cable, exposing a frayed edge. "That's not good," she muttered under her breath. "Talking to the wires?" A voice said. Rachel startled, bumping her head on the console. She spun to find a petty officer leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with mild amusement. His tone wasn't cruel, just curious. "Helps me think," Rachel replied quickly, brushing dust from her knees. The petty officer smirked faintly, but didn't answer, simply pushed off the wall and walked away. She exhaled, cheeks warm, and returned to the wires. Interactions like that reminded her of her place here. Background noise. Useful, maybe, but not essential. Still, the frayed cable worried her. She made a note to replace it, pulling a spare from her kit. As she worked, her mind drifted. She remembered her first job out of college, sitting in a tiny repair shop surrounded by police radios. Back then, she'd been invisible too, just the girl in the back room, fixing what others broke. No one ever thought much of the person behind the repair, only the result. She had grown used to being overlooked, but sometimes, just sometimes, she wondered what it would be like to matter in a bigger way. A burst of laughter jolted her back to the present. Across the room, a group of SEAL candidates had just finished their drill, faces flushed, uniforms damp with sweat. They sprawled briefly near the wall, catching their breath, water bottles in hand. Their energy filled the space, rough and raw. Rachel stole a glance, then quickly returned to her wires, but not before noticing the way they carried themselves, even exhausted. There was a coiled readiness in them, like wolves waiting for the next chase. One of them, the tall lieutenant she'd noticed earlier, stood apart from the group. He wasn't laughing, just observing, his sharp gaze sweeping the room like he was taking inventory of everything and everyone. For a moment, his eyes landed on Rachel again. Not long enough to be confrontational, but enough to make her fingers tremble slightly as she twisted a connector. She dropped the tool. It clattered loudly on the floor. Heads turned briefly, then just as quickly dismissed her. Except his. The lieutenant's eyes lingered a heartbeat longer before he finally turned away. Rachel's face burned. She scrambled to pick up the tool, muttering under her breath. Smooth. Real smooth. She tried to bury herself deeper into the console, retreating to the safety of circuits and solder. But no amount of focus could erase the feeling of being under a microscope. The atmosphere of the room was different now, tighter. Training schedules were accelerating. Voices grew sharper, and the officers' movements more deliberate. The air crackled with urgency, and Rachel felt it pressing against her ribs, forcing her to take shallow breaths. Then came the reminder she didn't need, but couldn't ignore. Civilians don't last long in here, someone muttered near the far table. She wasn't sure if it was meant for her ears, but it landed anyway. Rachel clenched her jaw. She wasn't here to last long. She wasn't here to prove herself. She was here to fix the damn radios. And yet, something about the comment dug deep, stoking that stubborn ember inside her, the one that hated being underestimated. She leaned back from the console, flexing her stiff fingers, and looked around the room again. The officers. The SEALs. The endless flow of information. She didn't belong here, but she couldn't shake the growing thought. What if she could? What if, for once, she wasn't just background noise? She shook the thought away. Dangerous. Pointless. This was their world, not hers. She needed to finish her work, stay invisible, and leave before anyone noticed she had even been there. But fate had a way of disregarding carefully drawn boundaries. Outside the glass wall, another drill was beginning. Vehicles rolled into position. Squads fanned out in perfect formation, rifles raised. Inside, the command center hummed louder, tension thickening as officers barked into headsets and recruits relayed orders. Rachel picked up her voltmeter, hand steady now, and leaned back into the console. Her reflection caught briefly on the monitor above her, small, quiet, out of place among the storm. She didn't know it yet, but soon all those eyes that barely noticed her would have no choice but to see her. The first sign of trouble was so subtle, Rachel almost missed it. A faint hiccup of static whispered across the nearest console. Then another. At first, it sounded like nothing more than background noise, the kind she had grown so used to that she barely registered it anymore. But as she soldered a wire into place, she felt the shift in the room before she fully understood what had happened. The command center's rhythm broke. "Alpha, say again. Your transmission cut out," an officer snapped into his headset. Silence followed. A beat later, another officer cursed under his breath, fiddling with dials on a separate console. Rachel's eyes flicked upward. The wall of monitors, which only moments ago had been alive with icons and data streams, now showed frozen blips. Red error symbols flashed like warning beacons. The steady flow of voices through the radios dissolved into static, like a chorus of whispers that had forgotten their lines. The silence that replaced it was louder than any alarm. Across the glass wall of the command center, the training ground outside continued as if nothing was wrong. Teams moved in tight formation, weapons raised, signaling one another. But inside, panic began to ripple beneath the surface. "Sir, we've lost comms with Bravo Squad," a petty officer shouted. "Check your frequency alignment," the commander barked. "It's not just Bravo, Sir Charlie's out too." Voices overlapped, rising in volume, urgency spiking like heat in a closed room. The SEALs waiting along the wall leaned forward slightly, sensing the change. This wasn't part of the drill. They knew the difference between simulated stress and real breakdown. Rachel's stomach tightened. She bent lower over her console, as though becoming smaller would protect her from the storm unraveling around her. Her instinct was to stay quiet, invisible. This wasn't her responsibility, not unless someone told her otherwise. But then the commander's voice cracked through the noise like a whip. "Get those radios back up. We're blind without them." A junior officer frantically toggled switches, his movements growing less precise with every failed attempt. "Sir, systems aren't responding. Signal pathways are dead." Rachel bit her lip, heart pounding. She knew that tone, that helpless panic in his voice. It was the sound of someone out of their depth, flailing for answers. She had heard it 100 times in smaller repair shops, when patrol officers brought her busted radios after trying to fix them with duct tape and guesswork. She knew that sound because she had lived in its shadow, always the fixer of last resorts. Her hands itched to reach for her toolkit. But she hesitated. This wasn't her place. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't part of the chain of command. She was just the contractor, the outsider with glasses slipping down her nose and a polo shirt that suddenly felt embarrassingly plain under the fluorescent lights. Then came the breaking point. One of the officers slammed his fist against the console. "Nothing. It's dead across the board." The commander spun toward Rachel without hesitation, his voice cutting sharp as steel. "You tech girl. Can you fix this or not?" Every head turned. Rachel froze. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Dozens of eyes pinned her to the floor, weighing, measuring, doubting. The SEALs leaned forward, their expressions unreadable. Even the lieutenant who had watched her earlier was staring now, his jaw tight, waiting. Her throat went dry. She wanted to vanish, to sink into the tiles, and leave no trace she'd ever been there. But instead, she heard her own voice, small but steady. "I can try." The words hung in the air like a fragile bridge across a chasm. And once spoken, there was no taking them back. The commander didn't hesitate. Then get to it. Rachel's body moved before her mind could catch up. She grabbed her toolkit, slid to the console, and yanked open the main access panel. The sight inside made her stomach drop, a mess of scorched wiring and fried circuits, like veins burned black from the inside out. She inhaled slowly. Okay, one step at a time. Behind her, the room erupted with continued chaos. Officers demanded updates, voices barked into dead headsets, tension mounting with every passing second. But inside the small circle of her work, Rachel forced the noise to fade. The world shrank to wires and solder, to the familiar click of tools in her hands. She tested a circuit with her voltmeter. Dead. Another. Dead. Finally, she found a faint flicker, a trace of power struggling to push through. Relief bloomed, but only briefly. It wasn't enough. Status? The commander barked. Working, Rachel muttered, though she wasn't sure anyone heard. Sweat formed at her temples as she worked. The frayed cable she had noticed earlier was worse than she thought, part of a chain reaction that had knocked entire pathways offline. If she rerouted power, she might restore partial function. But without replacement boards, the fix would be fragile, temporary at best. Still, fragile was better than nothing. Her fingers moved quickly, stripping wire, twisting connections, soldering under pressure. Sparks hissed. Somewhere to her left, someone muttered, "She'll never get it done in time." Rachel's jaw clenched. She blocked out the voice, blocked out the pressure, and focused on the circuit glowing faintly under her hands. "Come on," she whispered. "Just hold for me." The radio on the console sputtered, then crackled to life. "Alpha Team, awaiting orders, read you now." Every head snapped toward the sound. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then another voice cut in, clear and strong. "Bravo in position." Standing by. The room erupted not in chaos this time, but in stunned relief. Officers lunged for their headsets, barking renewed orders. The frozen blips on the monitors flickered back to life, teams outside once again tethered to the command center. Rachel tightened the last connection, her hands trembling, and sagged back onto her heels. She pushed her glasses up with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of dust across her temple. Her voice came out softer than she intended, almost swallowed by the renewed energy of the room. It should hold now, but people had heard. And for the first time, since she had stepped onto the base, silence wrapped itself around her again, not the silence of failure, but of awe. The relief in the command center lasted only a breath. "Alpha, read you wait. Signals breaking again." A voice hissed through the headset. Static drowned it out. The fragile lifeline Rachel had forced back into existence flickered like a candle in the wind. Monitors began to blink with error symbols again. One by one, the green indicators turned red. Groans rippled across the room. "Damn it, we're losing them again." The commander's eyes snapped toward Rachel. His tone was a mix of demand and desperation. "Well, can you stabilize it?" Rachel swallowed. She had known the patch would be temporary. The fried circuitry wasn't just damage, it was systemic rot. These radios hadn't been maintained properly for months, maybe years. What she had done was slap a bandage over a bullet wound. And now the bandage was bleeding through. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She could feel the doubt in the room thickening like fog. Officers whispered to each other. A petty officer muttered under his breath, "Should have called in base engineers?" Another shook his head. "She's just a contractor." Rachel's hands trembled for a moment. She wanted to retreat, to admit defeat, to vanish back into the shadows where no one could expect anything from her. That had always been the safe path. Do the minimum, get paid, stay unnoticed. But then her eyes drifted to the glass wall beyond the consoles. Out there, SEAL teams were mid-drill, rifles raised, moving through their training rounds with precision. She thought of the voices that had crackled briefly back into the room, voices that had been waiting for direction, trusting their lifeline to whoever sat at these consoles. And suddenly, the choice was clear. She couldn't walk away. Not this time. Rachel straightened, pushing her glasses up her nose. Her voice came out steady, carrying further than she expected. "I need to open the main junction. If you want this fixed, I'll have to reroute the entire system." The commander's eyes narrowed. For a second, Rachel thought he might refuse. But then his jaw tightened, and he gave a curt nod. "Do it." The room shifted around her. SEALs moved aside as she slid her toolkit across the floor and knelt before the primary junction panel, a squat, steel box at the center of the comm system. She unscrewed the front, revealing a spider's nest of wires and circuit boards, some scorched black, others corroded with neglect. Her stomach tightened. This is a disaster. She heard the scoff behind her. No way she gets that online. Rachel ignored it. She pulled on her gloves and grabbed her cutters. Her mind shifted into the zone she knew best, the narrow tunnel vision where everything else blurred out except the machine in front of her. She began stripping back wires, removing the ones too damaged to salvage. Sparks spat as she disconnected fried circuits. Smoke tickled her nose. Her hands moved quickly, almost instinctively, like a pianist who had practiced the same piece 1,000 times. She muttered under her breath, not caring if anyone heard. "Okay, power reroute. Bypass the surge line. Keep frequency alignment clean." The voltmeter beeped faintly. Still no signal. Rachel frowned, biting her lip. She leaned closer, tracing the pathways in her mind. The main power bus was fried, but if she rerouted through the auxiliary board, she might coax enough stability to hold. It wasn't designed for long-term use, but it could buy precious time. Her fingers darted, clipping wires, stripping insulation, twisting new connections. Sweat rolled down her temple. Static hissed in her headset again, faint but promising. Alpha team standing by. "Do you copy?" Rachel's heart leapt. She tightened another connection. Hold, don't drop." Then silence. She cursed under her breath, ripping out another corroded wire. Think. Her gaze darted to the soldering iron heating beside her. She grabbed it, pressing the tip against a loosened contact. The smell of burning metal filled the air. Sparks flew dangerously close to her sleeve. She didn't flinch. Around her, the room buzzed with doubt and impatience. "We don't have all day." Someone barked. Rachel's jaw clenched. She blocked them out. She wasn't fixing this for them. She was fixing it for the men outside, waiting in silence for guidance they couldn't hear. Finally, the voltmeter's needle jumped. Rachel's eyes widened. "Got you," she whispered. The console lights blinked green. One radio crackled, and another. A voice came through, sharp and clear this time. "Bravo squad, in position." "Orders?" Rachel almost laughed with relief. She pressed another wire into place, and more voices filled the air. "Alpha, Charlie, Delta." All the team's signals came rushing back in, one after another, like a flood bursting through a dam. The command center erupted again, but this time it wasn't panic, it was motion. Officers snapped into their headsets, relaying instructions. The commander leaned over the maps, his voice crisp and controlled. Alpha, move in. Bravo, cover flank. The room was alive again, humming with purpose. Rachel sat back on her heels, chest heaving. She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her glove, leaving a streak of grime across her face. The soldering iron hissed softly beside her, smoke curling into the air. It's stable now, she said quietly. Should hold until the boards can be replaced. For a moment, no one responded. The chaos of the drill filled the air, but inside the command center, a bubble of silence surrounded her. The petty officer who had scoffed earlier stared, mouth half open. Another shook his head in disbelief. And standing across the room, the tall lieutenant's gaze locked with hers. This time, there was no curiosity in his eyes. Only something harder, sharper respect. Rachel lowered her gaze, suddenly self-conscious. She began gathering her tools, trying to disappear again, to shrink back into her corner. But it was too late. Everyone had seen her. The comms boards glowed steady green. The voices of the SEAL teams carried through the headsets like a river in full flow, clear, sharp, alive. For a beat, no one moved. It was as if the command center itself was holding its breath, suspended in disbelief that the storm of static had finally been broken. The officers at their stations, frozen with half-typed commands, stared at their consoles as though expecting the lights to flicker red again. The air crackled with more than electricity. It vibrated with stunned silence. Rachel stayed on the floor by the open junction box, one hand still gripping the soldering iron, the other resting on a coil of stripped wires. Her chest rose and fell with the aftershocks of adrenaline. She could still feel the hum of the circuits through her fingertips, as if her own heartbeat had synchronized with the machine. Alpha team in position. Standing by, the voice on the comms came through again, calm and steady, confirming that the link wasn't just back, it was holding. Rachel looked up instinctively. Every head in the room turned toward her. The faces were a mix of shock, grudging admiration, and quiet awe. The petty officer who had doubted her earlier gaped openly, his headset slipping down around his neck. One of the younger sailors blinked as though watching an illusion. No one spoke. Rachel felt the weight of their stares and immediately wanted to shrink back into herself. She wiped her greasy gloves on her cargo pants and pushed her glasses higher on her nose. She forced a casual tone, though her voice trembled slightly. It should be stable now. Just don't overload it until you get proper replacements. The words felt small, out of place in the cavernous silence that followed. For a long, breathless moment, no one responded. The room was alive with sound that comes chatter, the clicking of relays, the background buzz of machinery, but between the people inside, there was only stunned quiet. And then, slowly, the commander stepped forward. He was a man carved from discipline, square-shouldered and immovable, his face lined by years of command. He had seen young recruits falter under his stare, had watched seasoned officers shrink when pressed by his questions. Now he stood still, arms folded behind his back, studying Rachel as though reassessing every assumption he had made about her since she walked into his facility. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. Good work. 2 words. Nothing more. But coming from him, they weighed like metals. The silence broke. Officers snapped back to their stations, relaying orders with renewed vigor. Fingers danced across keyboards, headsets filled with precise commands. The drill roared back to life as if it had never faltered. Yet in the center of it all, the image of Rachel kneeling by the junction box lingered. She could feel it, the invisible spotlight, the shift in how every pair of eyes in that room now saw her. She wasn't just the contractor anymore. She was the reason the mission was still alive. Rachel stood slowly, her knees stiff from crouching. She gathered her tools with methodical movements, as though tidying away the evidence of her presence might erase the attention she had drawn. She hated being the center of focus. She preferred the shadows, the corners, the safe anonymity of being unseen. But anonymity was no longer an option. The lieutenant across the room hadn't taken his eyes off her. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp even under the fluorescent lights, he carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively step aside when he walked by. His gaze was locked on Rachel, unreadable, as though he were studying not just what she had done, but who she truly was. Rachel felt heat rise to her cheeks under his scrutiny. She looked down quickly, fumbling with her soldering kit, pretending not to notice. The silence around her was different, now not stunned disbelief, but a thick, unspoken recognition. It was the kind of silence that followed a line being crossed, a boundary being broken. Rachel's own thoughts spun wildly. What just happened? Did I really? She replayed it in her mind, the fried circuits, the sparks, the doubt in their voices. The solder iron sparking dangerously close to her hand. The moment when the voices had finally come through, clear as bells. It had felt less like repair work, and more like pulling life back into a dying body. And she had done it. Her, not a uniformed officer, not a seasoned Navy technician. Just Rachel, the civilian tech girl, who had walked into this place clutching a battered toolkit. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt small, exposed, raw. The silence wasn't empty. It pressed against her from all sides, heavier than the noise it replaced. She slung her bag over her shoulder and turned toward the side door, eager to escape. She told herself she had done her part, that her contract didn't require her to linger, that the military could take it from here. She wanted nothing more than to vanish before anyone decided to say something more praise, questions, disbelief, anything that might keep her under their gaze. But just as she reached the threshold, she paused. The silence shifted again. It was waiting. Something was about to happen. Rachel didn't know what, but she could feel it in the stillness that followed her every step. It was as though the entire command center was holding its breath, watching, waiting for a cue that hadn't yet arrived. She turned slightly, her eyes flicking toward the lieutenant. His jaw was set, his expression firm, his gaze unwavering. And though the moment hadn't yet come, Rachel sensed it like a storm forming at the horizon. The silence was not the end. It was the drum roll, before everything changed. The silence was still heavy in the air when Rachel adjusted the strap of her toolkit and turned toward the exit. Every step felt amplified, the scrape of her boot, the soft jingle of her tools. She wanted nothing more than to disappear into the background, back to the quiet spaces where no one looked twice at her. But she didn't make it to the door. "Ma'am." The single word rang out across the command center. Firm, clear, unmistakable. Rachel froze. The title didn't belong to her. She wasn't ma'am here. She wasn't a ranking officer or someone in the chain of command. She was just a contractor, an outsider. The word hit her like a foreign sound in a familiar language, and her breath caught in her chest. Slowly, she turned. The lieutenant stood tall across the room, his gaze locked on her. His shoulders squared, his spine straight as a ruler, his boots planted with precision. For a heartbeat, the air between them was taut as a drawn bowstring. And then, with deliberate sharpness, he raised his hand to his brow. The salute cracked through the silence like thunder. The room froze. Every officer, every sailor, every enlisted man stopped in mid-motion. Fingers hovered over keyboards. Pens stilled above notepads. Headsets went slack in hands. Eyes widened. It was unthinkable. A salute was sacred, given only to superiors, to those who bore rank, who had earned authority in the rigid hierarchy of the Navy. To salute a civilian was unheard of. To salute a contractor, someone who had just been called the tech girl minutes ago, was nothing short of shocking. Yet there he stood, the lieutenant, unflinching, holding the salute as though it belonged there, as though Rachel had always deserved it. Rachel's throat tightened. She could feel her face heating, her chest constricting. Her first instinct was to wave him off, to laugh awkwardly, to insist that he'd made a mistake. She wasn't worthy of this. She wasn't trained. She hadn't worn the uniform. She hadn't stood in hostile territory with a weapon in her hands. She was just a girl with a soldering iron who had happened to get lucky. But the look in his eyes told her otherwise. It wasn't luck he saw. It wasn't chance. It was respect. The commander glanced from the lieutenant to Rachel. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't stop it. He didn't call it out of order. Instead, he inclined his head almost imperceptibly, as though silently agreeing. And then, as if on cue, the ripple began. One by one, heads turned toward her. The petty officer who had doubted her earlier straightened, his expression conflicted but resolute. His hand rose to his brow. Another followed. Then another. In seconds, the impossible happened. A room full of hardened SEAL operators and naval officers, men who had faced live fire and survived oceans of chaos, were saluting a civilian woman with grease on her hands and sweat streaking her temples. Rachel's breath hitched. Her knees felt weak. No, she whispered, shaking her head faintly. I don't? But her protest died in her throat, because in that moment, she understood. This wasn't about rank or uniform. This wasn't about protocol. It was about the lifeline she had given them, the bridge she had built when their mission teetered on the edge of failure. She had been their anchor when chaos threatened to swallow them whole, and that was something even the sharpest insignia couldn't measure. Her eyes stung unexpectedly. She blinked quickly, fighting the burn of tears. She hadn't cried in front of anyone since she was a child. She wasn't about to now. The lieutenant lowered his salute at last, but his eyes never left hers. You kept our men safe today, ma'am, he said quietly, his voice steady, reverberating through the hushed room. That deserves more than a thank you. Rachel swallowed hard. Words stuck in her throat. She wanted to respond, to say something clever or dismissive, to lighten the gravity of the moment. But all she managed was a small, hoarse reply. I was just doing my job. The lieutenant's lips twitched into something between a smile and a grim line. Sometimes doing your job means the difference between failure and survival. Don't sell yourself short. The words struck deeper than she expected. She had spent years hiding in the corners of her profession, downplaying her skills, content to be overlooked. And now, here was a man trained to face death itself, telling her that her work mattered, that she mattered. The others slowly returned to their duties, though the air in the command center remained altered, charged with something unspoken. Rachel felt it pressing against her, not uncomfortable, but undeniable. A shift had occurred. She wasn't invisible anymore. She bent to pack her tools, her hands still trembling slightly. The soldering iron clinked softly into its case. Every movement felt surreal, as though she were watching herself from outside her own body. When she straightened again, the lieutenant had stepped closer. Not too close, not intrusively, but enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the calm steel of a man used to carrying the weight of responsibility. What's your name? He asked. For a second, Rachel almost forgot. Her own name felt foreign on her tongue. Rachel. Rachel Morgan. He nodded once, firm, committing it to memory as though it were important, as though he'd never forget. Lieutenant Davis, he offered in return. The name stuck in her mind, sharp and solid. Rachel adjusted the strap of her bag again, but this time she didn't move for the door. Something rooted her there, tethered to the moment, unwilling to sever it too quickly. The salute would linger in her mind for years. Not because it was unusual, or because it had shocked the room, but because it had cracked something inside her. A shell she hadn't even realized she carried. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. Not as the invisible tech in the corner, not as the outsider, but as someone who had made a difference. And though she still told herself it was just a job, deep down, she knew it was more than that. For a long moment after Lieutenant Davis lowered his hand, the air in the command center remained suspended in that strange, weightless stillness. Though officers bent their heads back toward their stations, though headsets crackled with SEAL teams calling in positions, though the hum of the equipment resumed its mechanical chorus, something was different. The salute hung in the room like smoke after a gunshot, its echo impossible to ignore. Rachel still stood frozen, clutching her toolkit strap as if it might anchor her. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She could feel eyes sliding back toward her every few seconds. Quick glances, lingering stares. Not hostile, not exactly, but curious, unsettled, respectful in a way that made her skin prickle. She wanted to vanish. No one said it out loud, but she knew what they were all thinking. A salute? To her? The commander cleared his throat, the sound cutting sharp through the tension. "Back to your stations," he ordered, his voice clipped. "We've got a drill to finish." The officers snapped upright, grateful for the excuse to bury themselves in work again. But their movements were too quick, too precise, betraying nerves still rattled. Rachel exhaled, trying to loosen the knot in her chest. She had endured awkward moments before contractors often did. Usually, though, it was some muttered dismissal, some sideways comment about civvies getting in the way. She had grown used to fading into the background, nodding quietly, letting the uniforms handle their world while she handled hers. But this, a salute from a Navy SEAL lieutenant, was something no background could swallow. She bent down, pretending to adjust the latch on her toolbox, just to avoid their eyes. The metal clicked under her fingers. She lingered over it, hoping if she stalled long enough, the storm of attention would pass. "Rachel, right?" The voice startled her. She straightened quickly. It wasn't Lieutenant Davis this time, but one of the junior officers, a man barely older than her, headset pushed back around his neck. He was watching her with a sheepish expression. "Yes," she said cautiously. He nodded, as though confirming something to himself. "You really pulled us out of the fire. If that system hadn't come back up." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, it would have been ugly." Rachel fumbled for words. "I just fixed what I could." "That's not just," he replied firmly. Then, almost self-consciously, he gave her a tiny, awkward nod, half a bow, half an acknowledgement, before turning back to his station. Rachel blinked after him. It was small, but it spread warmth through her chest in a way she hadn't expected. She caught more whispers now, snippets of conversations barely above breath. "Never seen anything like that." "Earned it, though." "You saw what she did?" "Civilian, sure. But damn." Each word was like a ripple on the surface of still water, circling outward, widening. Rachel felt heat crawl up her neck. She wasn't used to being the subject of conversations, certainly not ones tinged with admiration instead of dismissal. Part of her wanted to correct them, to insist she hadn't done anything heroic, that she had just soldered wires and rerouted circuits. But another part, small, fragile, dangerous, wanted to let the words stand, wanted to believe them. Lieutenant Davis remained quiet. He had returned to his post near the commander, his posture straight, his eyes occasionally flicking toward her. He didn't need to say anything else. His salute had already shouted louder than words. The commander himself stole another glance at Rachel, his stern expression unreadable. She wondered if he was angry, if the salute had broken some unspoken order he held sacred. Or maybe, just maybe, he was reconsidering the way he measured respect. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Minutes passed, but the weight of the moment refused to dissolve. Every small action seemed to echo louder than it should. The clatter of keys, the shuffle of boots, the steady hum of machines. And underneath it all, Rachel's thoughts churned relentlessly. She thought of all the years she had kept her head down, content to be invisible. Of the countless jobs where she had been just the tech girl, forgotten as soon as the wires worked again. She thought of her father, who had once told her, "You've got the mind of an engineer, but you hide it like it's something to be ashamed of." Was this what he had meant? Her stomach twisted. She wasn't sure if the respect she had just been given was something she wanted or something she feared. At last, the commander's voice cut through again. "Drill complete. Stand down." The room exhaled collectively. Officers removed their headsets, stretching stiff shoulders, muttering debrief notes to one another. Some filed out. The command center gradually lost its frantic edge, settling into a quieter rhythm. Rachel seized the moment. She clipped her toolbox shut and slung it over her shoulder. Her heart still pounded, but she told herself that once she stepped outside, the air would clear. The salute, the stares, the whispers, they would all fade into memory. But as she turned toward the exit, the ripple followed. "Hey, Morgan," one of the enlisted men called. His tone wasn't mocking, not dismissive. It was the tone of someone calling to a peer. "Nice save in there." Rachel paused, blinking. She gave him a small, awkward smile. "Thanks." More nods followed, quiet acknowledgments, unspoken admissions that the salute had opened a door they hadn't even realized was there. She walked out finally, her boots echoing down the corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. With every step, the tension eased slightly, but the weight in her chest remained. Outside, the evening air was cool and sharp. Rachel inhaled deeply, tilting her head back to the darkening sky. For the first time all day, she felt like she could breathe again. But the memory lingered, the sharp snap of the lieutenant's salute, the ripple of respect that had followed, the shift in the room's atmosphere. It was a moment that had carved itself into her story, whether she liked it or not. And deep down, beneath the layers of embarrassment and disbelief, a spark flickered. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to live invisible anymore. The next morning, Rachel returned to the base with a cautious optimism she hadn't felt before. The early sun glinted off the metal rooftops, casting long shadows across the parade ground. Birds called out over the hum of engines and distant orders, but the previous day's memory remained vivid in her mind. The moment the lieutenant had saluted her, the ripple of respect that followed, the shift in the air that seemed to say she belonged, even if only for a fleeting instant. She carried her toolkit carefully, as though it were a talisman against being invisible again. But even before she reached the command center, she noticed subtle changes. A petty officer she passed gave her a brief nod, no words, just acknowledgement. A group of enlisted men glanced up from their equipment, their eyes lingering just a beat longer than before. The respect was quiet, understated, but unmistakable. Inside, the command center buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Officers and sailors moving like a synchronized machine. The consoles hummed, the headsets chirped, and monitors flashed with live feeds. Rachel found her corner, placing her toolkit down with practiced efficiency. Lieutenant Davis was already there, reviewing a set of tactical maps. When he saw her, he gave a small nod, not a salute this time, but a gesture of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that yesterday's events had altered the way he saw her. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. She had expected awkwardness, perhaps even whispers, or stares questioning her place here. Instead, there was only quiet respect. No fanfare, no ceremony, just acknowledgement that her presence, her skills, and her judgment mattered. She bent over the console, checking the communications lines. Everything was operational, stable. The crisis had passed, and yet, in a subtle way, the tension lingered not in panic, but in the unspoken memory of yesterday's failure and rescue. A young SEAL candidate approached, hesitant. Ma'am? I just wanted to say, thanks for, fixing it, Rachel blinked. Her instinct was to deflect, to brush it off. It's my job, she murmured, almost automatically. He shook his head. No, I mean yesterday. You. You saved us, literally. She felt her chest tighten. The words were simple, but they carried weight heavier than any paycheck, heavier than any acknowledgement she had received before. For the first time, Rachel realized that her work mattered in a way that transcended circuits and wires. It mattered to people, to lives, to a mission that depended on precision, courage, and quick thinking. Lieutenant Davis cleared his throat behind her. She turned, heart skipping. I want to debrief you, he said. There was no formality, no rigid tone, just clarity. Not for procedure, but so you understand how your actions affected the outcome. You did more than fix radios. You maintained our operational integrity. That's huge. Rachel blinked, feeling both pride and discomfort. She was still just a tech girl in her mind, but hearing it articulated this way forced her to confront a truth she had long avoided. She had made a difference, and it was visible to those who mattered. She nodded slowly, words catching in her throat. Thank you. Sir? He smiled faintly, a rare softness in his expression. No need to thank me, just keep doing what you do best. The day moved forward with a strange rhythm. Rachel checked systems, ran diagnostics, and assisted where needed, but the difference was palpable. Where before she had felt like a shadow, she now felt tethered, integrated. The small acknowledgments, the nods, the brief words, the glances built a network of quiet respect that she had never known could exist in a place so steeped in hierarchy and tradition. During a brief pause, she stepped to the glass wall, watching SEALs run drills outside. Their movements were precise, disciplined, flawless in execution. But Rachel noticed something new. They glanced toward the command center more often, a fleeting recognition of her presence. She realized, with a mix of surprise and satisfaction, that she was no longer invisible. Her work had left a mark. And then, the lieutenant appeared beside her, looking out at the training ground. You know, he said casually, you didn't have to be here yesterday. You didn't have to fix those comms under pressure. But you did. And that's why we salute you. Not because you wear a uniform, not because you have rank, but because you did what needed to be done. Rachel's throat tightened. I don't know what to say. Say nothing, he replied with a small smile. Just remember it. For a moment, she let herself stand there, absorbing the quiet weight of his words. They weren't just words. They were a recognition of her courage, her skill, her presence. In a world where she had always felt like an outsider, it was a rare, powerful validation. As the day wore on, Rachel returned to her work, but the sense of permanence lingered. The salute had created ripples subtle, quiet, yet undeniable. The officers and sailors no longer saw her as just a contractor. They saw her as someone who could rise to the occasion, who could hold steady when everything threatened to collapse. And in that recognition, Rachel began to see herself differently too. By evening, she stepped outside, looking back at the command center bathed in the glow of the setting sun. A building, once intimidating and forbidding, now seemed less daunting. It had been transformed, she realized, not by the walls or the machines, but by a single act of courage, by her willingness to act when no one else could. Rachel inhaled deeply. The air smelled of metal, oil, and the faint tang of the sea beyond the base. She felt grounded, steady. She had walked into that command center unsure, hesitant, and uncertain of her place. She would leave it with her head held a little higher, aware that she had earned a space in a world she had never expected to enter. She smiled faintly, almost to herself. The memory of the salute remained vivid, etched into her mind like a watermark she would carry forever. It was more than recognition. It was proof. Proof that courage and competence could transcend rank, uniform, and expectation. And as she walked away from the command center that evening, Rachel Morgan carried more than her toolkit. She carried a quiet confidence, a lasting impression, and the knowledge that sometimes the most extraordinary acts come from those who least expect to be noticed. The ripple she created would remain, subtle yet enduring, in every glance, every nod, every acknowledgement from those who had witnessed it. And she, once invisible, had become unforgettable.